Ho 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 and Merry Christmas all you horror fans. I'm Gina Ippolito, your resident campy 80s horror flick nerd, and this time I'm talking about one I rewatch every December, 1984's Gremlins. So turn down the lights and deck those halls. This is The Witching Hour. I've watched Gremlins more times than I can count. It's one of those movies I put on in the background while I put up my Christmas decorations. My brother and I were obsessed with it when we were little. He had a little Gizmo doll, and I had the pink Barbie Corvette that Gizmo drives at the end of the film. I stole my brother's Gizmo doll at some point and still have it at my mom's house in New Jersey, by the way, along with my Barbie Corvette. Gremlins didn't invent the horror comedy, but it definitely helped shape the subgenre. And it's the kind of movie that no matter how many times you see it, every frame is so packed with details that you notice something new each time. It also has an insane pedigree of movie-making maestros behind the scenes. It used nothing but practical effects to bring Mogwai and Gremlins to life, and did things with remote-controlled puppets that was never seen before. And in my opinion, that's what makes it the quintessential creature feature. One weekend in the early 1980s, a young Stephen Spielberg took home a stack of movie scripts to read, in search of his next producing project. One of the scripts, a film titled Gremlins, stuck out to him because it was written by a writer named Chris Columbus. Wondering if that was his real name or simply a nom de plume, Spielberg dove into the script and loved it. He bought the script, brought it to Warner Brothers, and co-produced it with his own production company, Amblin Entertainment. Then he attached low-budget horror director Joe Dante to bring it to life. This dream team shot it, it was a success, and the rest is history. Except with all 80s horror, it wasn't really that simple. Gremlins focuses on an inventor, Randall Peltzer, who, in search of a Christmas present for his son Billy, visits a mysterious shop in Chinatown, New York. There, he buys an adorable creature from the grandson of Mr. Wing, an old man who initially refused to sell it to him. The creature, a Mogwai with the name Gizmo, comes with 3 rules. You can't expose him to sunlight, you can't get him wet, and you can't feed him after midnight. Peltzer returns to his home in Kingston Falls, Pennsylvania, and gives Gizmo to Billy, who immediately screws up and breaks every one of those rules. Gizmo multiplies, and the other Mogwai eventually turn into terrifying gremlins who run amok in the town, terrorizing Billy, his mother, his dog Barney, and all the other Kingston Falls residents. Stripe, the gremlins leader with a sick white mohawk, spawns more gremlins and kills a few folks. Billy and his girlfriend Kate blow up most of the gremlins while they're hanging out in a movie theater, and in a final fight, Gizmo exposes Stripe to sunlight and kills him too. Mr. Wing comes looking for Gizmo, having seen the chaos on the news, and takes Gizmo back to his shop in Chinatown, setting everything right again. Except the town, that's still all kinds of messed up. Before he became the Christmas movie king, known for directing films like Home Alone and the first 2 Harry Potters, Chris Columbus was a film student at NYU. He wrote Gremlins when he was living in a crappy loft in New York City. At night, mice would come out of the walls and scamper around, brushing by Columbus's hands while he slept. He had a fear of these tiny furry creatures nibbling on his fingers and started coming up with the germ of an idea for a new movie. Columbus was born in Pennsylvania, and his mother worked for General Motors, and his father was an aluminum plant worker. Every weekend, his dad would spend hours under the family car, fixing it up and grumbling about the gremlins in the machine, causing it to break down. The term gremlin was widely used during World War II. Anytime something would go wrong with a plane in battle, they'd say it had a gremlin in it, messing things up. There's an homage to this origin in the finished film. Dick Miller's neighbor character, Murray Futterman, a World War II vet, at one point says when he's drunkenly getting into his car that they've got to watch out for gremlins, and that's the same gremlins that shot down our planes in the big one. So Columbus came up with the idea of small creatures called gremlins causing mayhem. He'd spent a lot of time in Chinatown because he was living on a struggling writer's budget, and he could always go there to find a cheap dinner. Walking around the city, he saw a lot of off-the-beaten-path shops that sold interesting things you wouldn't normally find in an average touristy store. He started thinking about how it would be interesting to find an odd pet in one of these Chinatown shops. As the movie was taking shape in his mind, Columbus wondered what to call the odd, pre-gremlin creature. He found a Chinese-American dictionary and looked up the word devil, which turned out to be Mogwai. Wanting nothing more than a good writing sample to prove he could write, Columbus's first draft was a hard R, low-budget black horror comedy script. He wrote it to be a sort of riff on the Christmas classic It's a Wonderful Life. There was a mean old miser controlling much of the small, idyllic town, and a good guy who clashes with the greedy villain. Gremlins Kingston Falls is a stand-in for It's a Wonderful Life's Bedford Falls. They both even have old movie houses on Main Street, and in the end, the good guy ultimately triumphs and the old miser gets their comeuppance. Of course, Gremlins was a much darker film than It's a Wonderful Life. The original script had Billy's mom getting decapitated and her head rolling down the stairs right when he comes home. It also had the gremlin Gremlins eating Billy's dog, and at one point going to a McDonald's and eating all the people inside while ignoring the burgers. Also, the teacher who gets a hypodermic needle in his butt originally got a whole bunch of needles in his face, making him look like Pinhead from Hellraiser. The rules around Gizmo and the Gremlins weren't in the original script. They were added during development. Filmmakers were concerned about the rules and had a lot of the same conversations that people have discussed ad nauseum online. Like, what if you feed a mogwai but it's midnight in Rome? And they wondered if audiences would think too much about them and be critical. In the sequel, they actually poked fun at a lot of these rules. Luckily, at the time, audiences just kind of accepted them and went with it. Columbus's agent sent his finished script out to producers, and after it made the rounds, Columbus got about 50 rejections. But then he got a call from Stephen Spielberg. At first, Columbus thought he was being pranked, but once he was convinced that it really was the Stephen Spielberg on the phone, the man behind Jaws, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Raiders of the Lost Ark, and E.T., Columbus couldn't believe his good luck. Spielberg said he loved the script for Gremlins, and Columbus flew out to LA to meet with him. With Spielberg's input, Columbus did about 10 drafts of the script, with each one inching it closer and closer to the film everyone now knows and loves. The studio didn't really know what to make of the script, but Spielberg convinced them to trust his instincts. With the early version of the script in hand, and still hoping to make the movie on the cheap, Spielberg wanted to find a director who could handle hard R, low-budget, campy horror, and he knew just the man to ask. Joe Dante cut his teeth in the 70s working for B-movie horror king Roger Corman. Having recently done 1978's Piranha and 1981's The Howling, movies that both winked at the culture of movies and paid homage to earlier films, Spielberg felt that Dante could bring the right mix of horror and comedy to Gremlins. The Howling, a werewolf slasher, also included a great werewolf transformation scene done entirely with practical and puppet effects. Spielberg enjoyed that movie so much that he cast Dee Wallace, who played Karen, to play Elliot's mom in E.T. As Dante was wondering where his next job would come from, an envelope arrived for him at his rundown office from Steven Spielberg. Like Columbus, Dante was convinced that this was a prank, or that the envelope had been delivered to the wrong person. But after talking with Spielberg and reading the script, he was all in and brought his friend and producing partner Michael Fennell on board. There was just one problem. The script had so many practical effects in it that it became obvious to Dante and Spielberg that doing it as a cheaply made horror movie wasn't going to work. Fennell actually thought the movie was impossible to make. After Spielberg got big studio backing from Warner Brothers, they had to tone down the slasher horror elements of it and amp up the whimsical elements. The film was shot for around $11 million. Not a big budget by any means, but more than a small horror movie. This would become Dante's first big studio movie, although it took so long to get an official green light that in the meantime, Dante and Spielberg worked together on 1983's Twilight Zone the movie. They also brought special effects wizard Chris Walas on board to design the Gremlins, and gave him some seed money to get started. When they gave Walas the good news that Warner Brothers had given the official green light, Walas was shocked. He'd assumed the movie was already greenlit, and had been killing himself with the puppet designs. With the team assembled and Columbus several drafts deep, Spielberg had one last story request. In the original version of the script, Gizmo, the adorable fluffy mogwai, turned into the monstrous gremlin stripe for the second half of the film. Spielberg proved his genius again by suggesting that Gizmo stay Gizmo through the entire film, acting as a sidekick to Billy, while the rest of the creatures turn into monsters. Dante is convinced that this change is what ultimately made the film so successful, turning the movie around and making it more emotional and accessible for the audience. But this change came with yet another problem. A puppet that had been designed to really only work for half the movie now needed to do so much more for the entire film, and Chris Walas was about to lose his mind. But before production could get underway, the dream team needed to find their dream cast. Spielberg wanted to cast actors who weren't yet super famous so that the audience could identify with them and not be hindered by the fact that they'd just seen them in something else. After failing to find anyone they liked with that classic Americana vibe in LA, they moved their search to New York. Zach Galligan had been in 2 or 3 films at the time and was considered an up-and-coming New York actor type. He got the notice that he was going to audition for a Steven Spielberg film and, like others before him, couldn't believe it. He was so excited and so nervous. When he went in to read, they paired him with Phoebe Cates, who Galligan said was so nice and sweet and laid back that she helped calm him down. Between takes, Galligan laid his head on Cates' shoulder in a friendly gesture and looked up at her. The producers saw their chemistry and felt it seemed like Galligan was already in love with Cates, and cast them both soon after. For the mean and miserly Mrs. Deagle, the Lionel Barrymore in It's a Wonderful Life stand-in, Dante cast Polly Holliday, known for her work on Broadway and in films like All the President's Men. The cast said Holliday was a lovely joy to work with and couldn't have been more opposite to her character. Singer, songwriter, and actor Hoyt Axton was cast as Billy's hapless inventor father, and when the beginning of the film's first first cut turned out to be too long, Dante knew that the fix was to use Axton's famous pipes to put in a noir-style voiceover that would bookend the film. Galligan credits the casting of Axton as one of the key reasons the movie was such a success, calling him a natural on camera. Columbus wasn't involved in the casting, but he was the most excited to find out that Hoyt had been cast, since he was a big fan of his music. The cast was filled out with A Streetcar Named Desire's Frances Lee McCain as Billy's mother, Judge Reinhold, who'd previously starred with Cates in Fast Times at Ridgemont High and originally had a much larger role in the film, as Billy's co-worker Gerald, and Pete was played by Corey Feldman, who after this would go on to star in the Chris Columbus penned The Goonies. Mushroom the dog played Barney, who everyone involved considered a ringer, since he thought the puppets were real and reacted to them in such a natural way as if they were other animals, looking at them with fascination and giving them unscripted little sniffs and licks. Mr. Wing was played by the extremely accomplished Key Luke, who, despite being 80 at the time, was so youthful looking that they needed to put old man makeup on him to play a believable grandfather. A sound designer was hired to come up with how Gizmo and the Gremlins would sound, and they actually wrote a gremlin vocabulary, which words they could say, like water, gizmo, caca, etc. The voices of the Gremlins were done in post-production and voiced by legend Frank Welker, which is a name any animation fan recognizes. He's voiced everyone from Fred and Scooby-Doo to Megatron and Transformers to Nibbler and Futurama. His IMDb is so lengthy that it would take me an hour just to list off everything he's known for. For the voice of Gizmo, Welker recommended comedian Howie Mandel, who'd never officially done voiceover work before, although he did do a lot of different voices in his act. If you listen to Gizmo's voice, you can hear a little bit of Bobby from Mandel's later animated show Bobby's World in there. Dante loved to put actors he'd grown up seeing in his films in small roles, so this movie is packed with cameos, including from Looney Tunes legend Chuck Jones, composer Jerry Goldsmith, who'd done the iconic Gremlins theme, and there's even Stephen Spielberg riding by on a weird-looking recumbent bike-style invention and wearing a cast since he'd just injured his leg not long before this. Sheriff Frank is played by acclaimed Western actor Scott Brady in his final role. William Shallert from The Patty Duke Show and a whole bunch of other stuff is in there briefly. There's also Harry Carey Jr. Seriously, everyone who appears in any frame of this movie is probably someone famous. And notice that cop? That's a young Jonathan Banks, aka Mike Ehrmantraut from Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. Like I said, the pedigree on this film is a thing of beauty. And it wouldn't be a Joe Dante film without his lucky charm, actor Dick Miller. I could write an entire hour-long video about this, but the horror community knows Dick Miller very well. And that's because of a character he played in other films, Walter Paisley. If you want to go down a very deep and delightful rabbit hole, Google Dick Miller Walter Paisley. But the very short version of this is that in Roger Corman's 1959 film A Bucket of Blood, Dick Miller played Walter Paisley, a busboy turned murderous artist who killed his subjects in gruesome ways. Then, in 1976's Hollywood Boulevard, produced by Corman and directed by Dante, another character named Walter Paisley appeared, again played by Dick Miller. He appeared again in The Howling, then in Twilight Zone the movie, and in one of my personal favorites, 1986's Chopping Mall. Even when the name Walter Paisley isn't spoken in the film, Miller is often credited with that name. A legend arose that these were all the same character, despite the fact that they almost always die in the films. Dante always tried to put Dick Miller in every movie he made, often killing him in funny ways, and he considered him to be his lucky charm until Miller's death at the age of 90 in 2019. But his legend lives on in Walter Paisley. In Gremlins, his official character name is Murray Futterman, but if you ask me, that's just a nom de plume, and his real name is Walter Paisley. He also pops up again in Gremlins 2, the new batch, despite it looking like he died in Gremlins, because Dick Miller is eternal. With the cast in place, shooting on Gremlins began in the dead of summer in 1983. Almost all of it was shot on the Warner Brothers and Universal backlots on sets in the same town square set that was used in Back to the Future. Dante wanted a very non-real, stylized look to the backdrops because he knew that the Gremlin puppets would look odd and fake if they were shot on location. Dante also knew that backlots evoked associations with old movies. He wanted the film to look like a mix of It's a Wonderful Life and The Birds. All the snow is fake, gypsum, sometimes with a layer of real snow on top for the night shots that had close-ups of the actors walking on it. The actors were bundled up in lots of winter layers, so they were all hot as hell in the summer heat of the Los Angeles Valley. But it all worked to make Gremlins look like a slice of stylized Americana. Executive producer Frank Marshall has said that Dante knows movies so well and so intimately that he was able to capture a dark side of Norman Rockwell's spirit. By making the Gremlins do things like singing Christmas carols in earmuffs in the snow, he turned the idyllic American life on its head. A big element of the film is Randall Peltzer's inventions that never quite work correctly. This again came from the association with the original meaning of the word gremlin, machines that broke down because of gremlins in them. It also ended up being an ironic subplot, as the Gizmo and Gremlin puppets broke down quite frequently. But all the fake inventions were thought up and realized by by production designer James Spencer. Go back and watch the movie and pay attention to them because they're so much fun and so detailed. Like I said earlier, every frame of this movie is packed with fun little Easter eggs, and this video isn't about all of those, but one of my favorites is the scene when Randall is on the phone at the Inventors Convention. There's so much stuff going on in this scene. I'm just gonna point out some of it. First of all, this is the scene where Spielberg makes his cameo. There's also a character that's the crew's goof on Joe Dante. Back then, anytime Dante directed, he'd wear dark sunglasses at all times and a white button-up shirt and a knit tie. The guy in the scene who comes out of the phone booth is wearing Dante's exact outfit. The guy in the big hat and loud jacket is the film's composer, Jerry Goldsmith. But my favorite part of this scene happens in the background. When Randall is talking on the phone, in the background is a large time machine. The scene cuts, and when it cuts back, the time machine is gone, and there's just some smoke in its place, while two people look around wondering where it went. Again, this film has so much great stuff in it. Speaking of Goldsmith, when he wrote the Gremlins theme with that big, boisterous music, Dante wasn't sure that what he considered a kind of carnival-esque song was exactly right for the film. But then he remembered that Jerry Goldsmith is a legend and let him do his thing, and it's now iconic. Gizmo's theme that he sings was also written by Goldsmith, but it was actually not vocalized by Howie Mandel. Instead, Goldsmith enlisted the help of a young female soprano from his temple to step in and sing. One of the film's most iconic fight scenes came about because of an off-the-cuff remark made by Zach Galligan. When he saw the sporting goods store set that would be the location of the final Billy Gizmo Stripe fight, he noticed that the production had put in a chainsaw as an homage to Texas Chainsaw Massacre. He noted that it would be cool for Billy and Stripe to have a baseball bat on chainsaw battle, and members of the crew agreed and made it happen. Because of brutal hours and things frequently going wrong on set, Dante realized that the crew needed a way to blow off some steam. So he set up a board where they could make suggestions on absolutely horrible things the Gremlins could do to Gizmo, since the puppet was a source of a lot of their frustration. One suggestion was that the Gremlins would pin Gizmo to a dartboard and throw darts at him, and voila, that made it into the movie too. But one scene that made it into the movie was a source of frustration and anxiety for the studio. Dante included the now famous Phoebe Cates' dead dad monologue because he felt like it encapsulated the whole tone of the film. It's so weird and dark but oddly funny, and the audience wouldn't know whether to laugh or cry, which was very much Dante's vibe. This monologue was actually what made Phoebe Cates want to take the role, and it's totally insane. She talks about how on Christmas Eve, when she was 9 years old, her dad never came home. Police searched for him but couldn't find him, and when a few days had passed, she noticed a smell coming from the chimney. So firemen opened the chimney up, and there was dear old Dad.
He was dressed in a Santa Claus suit. He slipped and broke his neck, died instantly. And that's how I found out there was no Santa Claus.
Execs hated this monologue. They wanted it cut and thought the audience would walk out when they heard it. The editor told Dante it would never make it into the final cut of the film. Even Spielberg didn't like it, although he felt like this was Dante's film and he knew what he was doing, and if he wanted it left in, it should be left in. Dante was adamant that it stay in because it was so unique and twisted, and now it's one of people's favorite things in the film. They did a send-up of it in Gremlins 2, again with Phoebe Cates, and it's even funnier. Now it's time for the good stuff, the crazy practical effects that you know I love so much. These are what made Gremlins. The animatronic puppets were super sophisticated. Never before had a filmmaker been able to pull off puppets having such distinct personalities. The initial sketches of the Gremlins were done by Chris Columbus, who had an idea in his head of what they should look like. Before they settled on doing puppets, Dante actually brought in a rhesus monkey and put a Gremlins mask on it, but the monkey crapped everywhere and freaked out, jumping around once the mask was on, and Dante knew that was never gonna work. CGI also wasn't an option. It was extremely limited and primitive at the time, and could never handle something as elaborate as what was needed. So after the other options had been exhausted, that's when Chris Walas was brought in to work his magic. Walas made himself sick working on the designs for Gizmo and the Gremlins at the same time at a bonkers pace. He knew that the creatures had to be opposites, cute and cuddly versus scaly and nasty, but they also had to look similar since the Gremlins are another biological step away from Mogwai. He felt like the big ears were the key to linking them together. The ears were also an easy way for the puppets to show emotion. Walas and his team could make them shoot up when they heard something and were on alert, or smooth them down when they were scared, or fold them back when they're angry. Walas took inspiration from an animal called a tarsier. He exaggerated the features and gave it even bigger eyes and ears and a disproportionately large head. They tried out a bunch of different color schemes for the Mogwai, but Spielberg wasn't a fan of them. At the time, Spielberg had 2 King Charles Cavalier Spaniels, and Walas had the idea to make Gizmo's fur the same color as Spielberg's dogs, and finally he approved the designs. Walas built 2 sets of puppets, smaller ones for most of the wide shots, and large-scale heads that could show emotion more easily because they could fit more electronics inside. With the smaller puppets, they had removable faces, and each time they needed to change expressions, they'd have to physically peel off the face from the hollow head and then put another expression on with spirit gum to hold it in place. The big ones didn't need that changeover since they could emote without switching anything. Anytime there's a close-up of Gizmo, that's the oversized head, which was about 2 feet across. They needed to create oversized props anytime this was used, so everything was to scale. So when the Mogwai are eating chicken, those are huge prop chicken legs and chicken wings. Each puppet took about 5 people to control. One of the other reasons everything was shot on sets, in addition to Dante wanting a specific look, was they had to raise up the sets and cut holes in everything, so that the people controlling the puppets could be under the floor, watching scenes on a black and white monitor, and wearing headphones and working the puppets with joysticks. They often spent hours under the sets, crouched in the same uncomfortable positions just to get the shots they needed. Gizmo was the biggest pain in the butt to work with. Like the shark in Jaws, he broke down constantly. It was very hard to make the puppets look real when walking, so they came up with the idea to put Gizmo in a backpack and have Galligan carry him everywhere. Wayless's team had to tape the many wires from the animatronic to Galligan's body and loop them down his body through a hole in his sock, so he'd be carrying Gizmo and dragging the wires along. The wires would go to people with joysticks. One person would control the ears, one the mouth, one the nose, all under the sets. Anytime a puppet would break, they'd have to shut down the set to fix it for hours at a time. Wayless built a ton of puppets. Some of them had no articulation and could just open and close their mouths and move their arms, which was perfect for shots where they were in the background. Legs on puppets are hard to do, so that's why gremlin legs are so short. They had longer arms reinforced with rods so they could throw and hold things. All in all, Gremlins spent about 1.5 years in pre-production and production, and only about 6 months of that was shooting, since so much time was spent designing the puppets and getting them to work. They shot for 3 months with the human actors and only minimal gremlins, then shut down for 3 weeks so Wayless could get everything up to snuff. Then they spent 2.5 months of intense gremlin-only shooting. After all the other actors had finished, they shot the most difficult scene, which was Kate's in the bar with all the gremlins doing crazy things. Dante said it was a nightmare, and the set stunk, and it was almost impossible to get, but it ended up being Spielberg's favorite scene of the whole movie, so it was worth it. Wayless designed the Mogwai that turn into gremlins to be a little harsher and edgier looking than Gizmo. When they turn into egg sacs, these were done with latex filled with colored lights. This was the point in the original script when Gizmo was going to turn into Stripe. So Wayless had to scramble to turn a puppet that was only supposed to work for 1 reel into something that would work for the entire film. The awesome scene when Billy's mom kills a gremlin by tossing him in a blender was created using just a hollow gremlin puppet shell filled with leftover rubber puppet bits and green goo. Then they put an air ram under it to make the gremlin look like it was bursting everywhere. The first time they did this shot, they used too much green blood, and the crew and set were covered in it. When the scene was shown to preview audiences, they lost their minds, and that's when the filmmakers had an idea that the film might just be a hit. When they did the shot of Stripe going down in the pool, the puppet kept flipping upside down and in the wrong direction, so they had to do a ton of takes. Finally, by the 61st take, they got the shot, and that's when they realized they'd forgotten to put the puppet's distinctive white stripe on his head. The puppeteer was reportedly very upset when they realized this. To get the whole cool bubbly water effect, they used dry ice, a bunch of agitators, and colored lights, which sounds so simple for how cool that shot is. Dante loves stop motion, something Corman was also known for, and so he used it for the scene when all the gremlins descend upon the town. That's a whole mini town set there. Once the studio saw the dailies for Gizmo, they started talking about merchandising almost immediately because he was just so damn cute. E.T. had really paved the way for tons of merchandising based on a cute little puppet creature. Despite the studio's approval, Wayless was terrified that everyone would hate the puppets. So he saw it for the first time with a full audience, and when Gizmo comes out of the box for the first time, the audience went, "Aww," and he breathed a sigh of relief for the first time in months. By the way, when Gizmo's arms reach out of that box, those are extra long arms designed by Wayless, since Gizmo's little stubby arms wouldn't have been long enough to reach the top of that box. Gremlins was released on June 8th, 1984, the same day as Ivan Reitman's Ghostbusters. Yup, it's a Christmas movie that was shot and released in the summertime. It made $12.5 million that first weekend, and made even more the second weekend, which was extremely rare. It was the fourth highest grossing film in the US that year, behind Ghostbusters, Beverly Hills Cop, and Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. 1984 was a hell of a year for movies. Gremlins ultimately grossed over $148 million. Critical reception was almost universally positive, although a lot of people didn't quite know what to make of that Phoebe Cates monologue when they first saw it. There were a few complaints. The ad campaign for the film revealed almost nothing about what it was. So audiences saw Spielberg's name and the hand of what looked like a cute, cuddly creature, and mistakenly thought it was going to be like another E.T. Some critics and parents felt misled, accusing Dante Dante of making a horror movie for children. But at the first screening, the audiences went nuts for it. They had no idea what they were in for, but they enjoyed the ride. It became a cultural hit overnight. Even notorious nitpickers Siskel and Ebert gave it high marks. Leonard Maltin, on the other hand, called it icky mayhem. It's time for my best kill and best one-liner. There are a lot of deaths in this movie, including all of the Gremlins, and they're all awesome. But I'm giving best kill to the Gremlins killing Mrs. Deagle, with her flying up the stairs and out the window on her electronic chair. Her legs end up sticking straight out of the snow like the Wicked Witch of the East. There are a lot of good one-liners in this movie too, and my initial inclination was to give it to Phoebe Cates' entire monologue. But since I've already talked about that at length, I'm gonna give it to Stripe's meta nod to another Steven Spielberg film. Oh no. This movie is filled with delicious meta goodness, and I'm here for it. The legacy of Gremlins is a vast one. It inspired a whole slew of puppet-centric creature features, from Ghoulies to Troll. Don Mancini, writer and creator of Child's Play, said it absolutely influenced him with Chucky. Gremlins made stars of everyone involved. Galligan became recognizable overnight as his face started appearing on backpacks and lunchboxes. Dante obtained a new level of mainstream legitimacy he hadn't had before. He said he was no longer the guy who worked for Roger Corman, he was the guy who worked for Steven Spielberg and made a movie people wanted to see. Gremlins and Gizmos started popping up everywhere, as toys, in video games, and in other films, like the Lego Batman movie, Teen Titans Go, and the new Space Jam. There's another meta call out to the film in The Goonies that Chris Columbus put in, when the sheriff dismisses Chunk's concerns as another one of his tall tales. In 1990, Joe Dante did Gremlins 2, The New Batch, and if you haven't watched the Key and Peele sketch about this movie, go look it up immediately. The sequel is somehow more insane than the original. There's also an absolutely delightful animated series called Gremlins Secrets of the Mogwai that's 2 seasons in right now. But maybe the most insane bit of legacy lore about Gremlins is that it fundamentally changed the movie rating system. When this and Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom came out, both films were rated PG. The rating options at the time were either G, PG, R, or the dreaded X. After those films came out, people realized that there needed to be something in between PG and R if you're going to be showing Gremlins getting blown up and electrocuted and stuff. The ratings board invented the PG-13 rating because of this movie. So you can thank Gremlins for not being able to see certain movies when you were 12 years old. In early November of this year, it was announced that a third Gremlins film is in the works. Steven Spielberg is returning to executive produce, and Chris Columbus is returning to direct and produce. And this time, the film will get a proper holiday release date in November of 2027. Be sure to check out the other video essays on our channel. Let me know in the comments what kind of horror movies you'd like to see me talk about. Follow me everywhere at Gina Ippy, and subscribe to The Witching Hour if you haven't already. Until next time, bye bye, Billy.